Thank you all very much. It is a pleasure to be with so many principled, freedom-loving Americans. There are lots more of them out there, or I wouldn't have gotten elected in Virginia. For this group in particular, I know that you're as glad as I am that after there's been a great dormancy in federalism and in the efforts to rein in the federal government constitutionally, that it's back. It's back. We thought it was dead for decades, but in the 90s it began to have signs of life again. And now today, following a tremendous history in this country where our founders pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to establish this nation on a foundational set of principles, first principles, eternal principles that apply as much today in 2011 as they did in 1776. To defend those principles, and that Americans are waking up, that this isn't some history lesson. This matters not just to our government and to our nation, but in their particular lives, in their house, when they're sitting around their kitchen table. The federal government is intruding on their options and how they live their lives. And as we have gone on, the American people, frankly, this is our government, have asked government to do more and more for us, and all the courts and the politicians that are happy to accommodate have ever asked for in return is just a little bit more of our liberty, one bit at a time, one little bit at a time. And now we no longer have a federal government of limited, enumerated powers. We have a central government that attempts to dictate virtually every aspect of how we live our lives and what our options are in how we do that. That is not what the Founding Fathers had in mind. That is not what they had in mind. But I have hope, real hope, the actual kind, not what you heard about in 2008. I have real hope because I have seen myself, Americans, Virginians, waking up to what's happening to their country and to what's happening to their government, and not because some political party or another has motivated them. I mean, let's face it, this isn't a 2-year problem. The 10-year version is when the Republicans had the House, the Senate, and the presidency. They grew spending and regulation like nobody's business, like nobody in this country can do except, well, Democrats. And the one line I remember from John McCain from the 2008 race was that saying Republicans were spending like drunken sailors is offensive to drunken sailors. And at least they were spending their own money. Absolutely true. And spending, taxes, and regulation are the 3 ways government increases its power. And every time they do any of them, it comes directly at the cost of our liberty. It is a zero-sum game, folks. It is a zero-sum game. Now with federalism reemerging, states are taking the role the founders had in mind for them to combat a federal government overstepping both the spirit and the letter of the Constitution. The most extraordinary example of this, of course, is the health care litigation in which Virginia, Oklahoma, those are 2 separate suits, and then 26 states together out of Florida are suing the federal government to protect the Constitution from the federal government. It's an extraordinary thing to contemplate, but that's the role, one of the roles that the founders envisioned for states when they set up our system. You know, people hear about checks and balances, except for Chuck Schumer. They think there are 3 branches to that, judiciary, executive, and the legislative. But there's also a vertical check and balance, and it's what we call federalism. It's the check between the federal and state governments on one another's authority in our constitutional system. Never before have over half the states sued the federal government on the same issue that the federal government was violating the Constitution. It's never happened before. It's another aspect of this case that is truly unprecedented. It's unfortunate, but unprecedented. When we won for the first time in December of last year, when we got that first federal judge to rule the individual mandate unconstitutional, we started I wouldn't say a trend, the judges are going to decide on their own, but then our sister states in Florida got a truly extraordinary ruling from Judge Vinson. And if you want to read one document and understand this case, read Judge Vinson's ruling from the Florida case at the end of January. He walks through the history, the cases, how it applies to this law, this statute, and it's the one document, it's the cliff notes of this case. It's the cliff notes of this case. Our argument is simply that the Commerce Clause doesn't give the federal government the power to tell you to get into commerce. They can't order you into commerce. If you get into commerce, they can regulate you, but they can't order you to go buy something, order you into commerce. That has never happened before. Never has the federal government, under the guise of regulating commerce, ordered Americans to buy product. And we argue that they don't have that power. If they can order you to buy this, they can order you to buy anything. That's why this case is about liberty, not health care. It's about liberty, not health care. Because as big as health care is, 1/6 of our economy, it's a very personal type of decision. You can categorize it any way you like. It's today's issue. 100 years from now, they're going to order you to buy something else. If you want to toss a funny thought around in your head, toss around the notion of a bill that orders every adult who isn't crazy or a felon to buy a gun, and see if the same people who voted for this bill would vote for that one. You think they'd say, oh, you can't do that? Really? Why? It'd be a very quiet day for that question. The federal government's argument is simply that not buying insurance is an economic decision to self-insure. Isn't that clever? If a company self-insures, there's all sorts of economics they've got to make arrangements for. If you self-insure, that means you're not doing anything. You're just rolling the dice. God bless America, you get to do that. Or you did, depending on how this case goes. It's a very clever way of saying doing nothing, self-insure for an individual. The judge in the District of Columbia who ruled for the federal government that the individual mandate was allowable at least was honest enough to say what they're regulating is your mental activity. Her phrase, not mine, mental activity. George Orwell, sequel. But that's what they're doing. Ultimately, this is going to be decided by the Supreme Court. My expectation is it'll be decided in the spring, summer of 2012 timeframe, which is very interesting for other reasons. But the Supreme Court is going to decide this. And it is a case of first impression. Nothing like it has ever happened before. The federal government has never presumed to have this power before. In the colonial era, when we were boycotting British goods because of the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts, the Attorney General and the Solicitor General for the King sat in the Parliament in that time. That was the tradition. And the question was asked, isn't this boycott of British goods treason? And one of them answered, well, the colonists are well advised legally. I hope they still are. It's not for me to say, but they're well advised legally. They have come right up to the line but not crossed it. Now think about that. Flip that coin over. They were conceding that they couldn't order us to buy British goods when we were subjects of the king. But we have a president and had a Congress that thinks they can. That is historically astounding to me. It is amazing. Now, don't let them tell you this is just some other ordinary exercise of regulation. It's not. It's historically unprecedented. The month before we sued on the health care legislation, we had already, as Tim mentioned, sued the EPA, the Employment Prevention Agency, over their greenhouse gas endangerment finding. Not because of the policy of it, and I don't like the policy of it, but because it's illegal. And they disregarded the law in implementing that regulation, and they continue to. They declared CO2 and several other greenhouse gases pollutants. Of course, we're all breathing CO2. Let's all annoy Lisa Jackson together, shall we? Everybody exhale with me at the same time. 1, 2, 3. Hi, Lisa. Lisa Jackson is the head of the EPA. The power they're exercising in regulating CO2 emissions is extraordinary. Economically, it's Waxman-Markey cap and trade done administratively. The impacts are just as devastating to our economy and the opportunities for us and our children and our nation going forward. The EPA, in doing this, relied on data that the ClimateGate scientists made famous, or they didn't make the data famous because they won't show it to anybody, but you get the idea.